Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? Hanging in there? I'm going to go ahead and start with attendance here. All right. So I went through your projects. Actually, there's one I haven't reviewed, but for the most part, I've got everyone's graded, and the overall was pretty good. A lot of the models were really nicely done. There wasn't a lot of big time errors or anything like that, so that was nice. Did everyone get the videos? I sent a lot of you videos, or not videos, but feedback and scene files. Brad sent you one. Did you see it in the comments?
Yeah, I saw the feedback. I haven't seen the scene file yet.
Okay. Gentry, I sent you one. Some feedback. Did you see that? All right. Just want to make sure you're getting that and looking at it, and looking at all the information, because I try to spend a lot of time to give you feedback so that you can see maybe an alternative way to do something, or a way to fix a problem, or something like that. So now that we're done modeling the object that we have, we're not going to be modeling anymore. We're going to be working on the actual details of it, on the way it looks, the surface, the materials, and the textures that are going onto it. If we look back at the notes on the shading models, we're going to be working in what's called the Hypershade. The Hypershade is a new panel that we're going to be working in, and it's going to give us the ability through nodes and attribute editor panels and creation editors and something more like along the lines of our shelf, to look at the different materials that we are creating and what the end result is going to look like. So depending on the kind of material that it is, if it's a typical metal or wood or plastic or glass, something along those lines that has a basic appearance of some sort. But now we're going to be dealing with color, and we're going to be dealing with the surface features at the level that we typically don't have to worry about as far as painting sculpting the details. They're usually so fine that we wouldn't want to have a model that we had to actually sculpt in details, such as the details of pores or bumps or those types of things. We're going to use images or procedural texturing to simulate those types of things, so we don't have to worry about it. But we're going to be working today in the Hypershade, and the Hypershade is available by clicking on the little icon up in Maya in our scene. We have up by where we have our render settings and all those things, there's a little icon right here, and that will bring up what's called the Hypershade panel. In an empty scene, it gives you a few little details. The materials that are already here, that are the default materials, such as the Lambert. The textures are going to be built in this section. That's when we start building what's called 2D textures. We have a variety of different types, or 3D textures, which we have a variety of different types, and these will be represented in this panel. And once you get into more complex, there are utilities that do things like mathematics and other things behind the scenes that give us a lot of different options. There's bunches of utilities here that we can add that will work with values or colors or all kinds of stuff. This is basically like visual coding, and this is where you can start to build up very complex materials. This is where the lights in our scenes are, and the cameras in our scenes are, and different kind of shading groups, and all kinds of stuff that we might want to have access to. But typically, for what we're doing, we're just dealing with materials, textures, and you can get to your lights and cameras here if you want once you start creating them. We have a create panel here, which is where we will be creating the surface types or the materials that we use. Now we're just working with some very basic materials. We have our blend, our anisotropic, We have Phong, Phong-E, but there's a variety of, we used this background shader the other day, and all of these material types have different attributes for different purposes. Hair, for example, Bifrost, which are things that we're not working with, fluid systems, and all kinds of things that are beyond the scope of this class. But that stuff does exist, and there's volumetric things, displacement maps, and all kinds of other textures that, again, we won't be getting into. But it's this area of digital media or 3D modeling is a field in itself. It's an art in itself, creating textures. That could be your job, just to build and develop textures for people who need them. And so, again, we're just going to touch on the basics of this, how we create them, how we connect them, and then how we can build what we would call a texture network of some sort, or that might utilize a variety of inputs and outputs. In this section, we are going to see, once we start building a network, we're going to see the network here in a series of connected nodes like this. One node will feed into another node, and these will become much more complex types of networks. Again, we have the visor area, the create bar, we have the working space, and then we have the different materials, the shading materials, where we can get more directly into creating a specific material, just like we had done earlier when all we did was basically think about, is it shiny or is it dull or semi-shiny, and we could see the results. The different material types, again, if you want to get into the different material types specifically, each one of them has a link here that you can open up, and you can read about the descriptions and the different attributes that they have and what those attributes do, like what is cosine power, what this material might be good for, glossy surfaces, car moldings, telephones, bathroom fittings. So that might help you kind of pick out one that might work best for your situation. I typically just stick with a blend for mini applications because it's fairly versatile, and you can kind of get the idea of all the different elements of it. But you can certainly look at all these different ones and see what their overall descriptions are. What I want you to be doing for this project is becoming a little more familiar with the attributes, such as the color attributes, because this is where we will begin to build our unique textures for our object. So we have a material, which is a blend, but the textures are going to be procedures or files that we use. So a file is like a picture, like a static image that we create, right? Of a checkerboard or of a painted surface or something like that. It's literally a photograph of something, or something you draw or paint in Photoshop or something like that. That will be a texture. It doesn't really change much unless it's what's called tileable. And if it's tileable, then you can duplicate it in X and Y, and it will create a seamless texture that you can't see the edges of, that looks like a continuous flowing surface. So if you look at your ceiling in some houses and it has this texture on it that you can't, it's just a continuous flow, you might want to do that. So a lot of times materials are created, people will create tileable textures that you can use, that when you duplicate them X number of times, they get smaller, but they get more and more basically duplicates of the image, but you can't see the seams, basically. Does that make sense? It's a tileable or seamless image. My favorite place to see some of these is what's called textures.com. And they are a company. It used to be called CG Textures. Here you can go in and you can look up something like plastic. And if you search for a plastic, you can see a bunch of materials. And these are super big materials that you might want to see. But as you go down, people are building these networks. Well, they're basically building pictures that you can use, but some can be tileable or not. And if you go down, you can see some These are a little more complex. And they basically work with taking different types of elements. This is, they might take skin textures. They might take other things. So I use these a lot. When I come in, I might look for plastic or a brick or stone. So I will look for something that will act like, which will basically be a texture of some sort. So basically, we'll look for something like this, something that might be seamless. See how it says seamless there? Seamless. So that when I use this, I can duplicate this and create a preview. If I preview this, if it'll show up here, as I increase or decrease this, so if I use the actual image and I don't duplicate it at all, I get this. But then as I duplicate it, it gets smaller and smaller, but it starts to repeat that image and starts to create a tile. Does that make sense? So this is a tileable image. You can't see the seams too bad. It's pretty good. You wouldn't want to use one like that whenever it isn't tileable, unless you can just use the whole image for your scene. So we'll be looking for things like that. So some of you have like wood. You might want to look up wood. First, you can get free images here if you join in, and they'll give you like 15 credits, which might be good for 7 or 8 pictures that you can use. You can find some online. But we're using basically just these images. This is up here for surface. Here's a nice image of some wood of some sort. Unless you make your own, you're going to have to get something that's similar to what you need. You know, you could make your own, like Brett, you've got a guitar. We may not find a guitar, but you might have to find a wood like it, or you could actually make your own. Or you could get by with maybe something like this, but you might not find exactly what you're looking for. But you might find something that someone has made, or you can make it yourself. I make some myself a lot of times. But this would be a file texture. We have the ability to map these onto surfaces, basically we can map them into different channels of our material, into a color channel, into a transparency channel, into all of these different channels. You can literally put in something to define what that attribute is going to look like. And what we're going to be doing is, in some cases, we will be working on controlling something like transparency, not so much with a picture, unless it's a black and white picture, because you can treat some of these things as on and off switches. Transparency can be on at a value of 1, it can be off at a value of 0, and at a value of 5 or point something, it can be semi-transparent, like this is semi-transparent. So off, you can think of it as a value, 0. You can think of it as a value of 1 to turn it on, or you can think of it as black and white. Black, or 0, is off, or white is on fully, and then some shade of gray will control that. Does that make sense to everybody? It's like think of it like an on and off switch. And we'll look at examples of this. So incandescence is going to give it the feeling of it's a looping, and light is emitting from it. Some of you may have a button that you might want to have on, which we could try to use translucency if you want to have like a power button on, or a screen that has a slight glow to it. We also have glow attributes that we could adjust, but we want to be very careful with it because it can bloom on our screen and become overpowering in some cases, but we can create some of those things. Translucence values has deeper values where you can put an object inside of something and then have a light in there, and that object would cast a shadow and the light would be allowed to go through the surface, just like you were looking through a lampshade or a window shade of some sort where you have light in that, and a light bulb inside of it, and light is coming through, but you also have maybe the frame or the wires that hold the lampshade up might be in there too, casting shadows onto the surface. So you can simulate and create these types of things. The diffuse value is going to be what value allows the true color of the object to be visible. Zero diffuse will be black, and you see that a lot in chrome where something really doesn't have its own color value. It's reflective of something. So this has a value of 0.4, so it's a little darker than what it would be at 1. So it's kind of an orange color like we've had examples of before. Then we get into specular shading, when we have things that actually, when you have a light in the scene, then it actually reflects that light with a highlight of some sort, where you can modify the size and the control of the highlight. And we start looking at things like specularity and specular roll-off and eccentricity. And these names and attributes are different per material. So you might see eccentricity in blend, but you won't see that. You'll see cosine power, or you'll see something else in another material. But they're controlling the value of, that's why we want to use this, like eccentricity, for example, in the blend attribute controls the size of the shiny highlights on the surface, whereas if we were to look up another value, cosine controls the size of the shiny highlights on the surface. So it's not the same terminology all the time, but you're controlling the highlights on the surface of an object. Does that make sense? So you have to kind of experiment a lot of times with these. And some of these values you can control with black and white maps or 0 to 1 ranges, which you can do that through experimentation too. So what you're going to be doing is, I want you to utilize some of the notes here, because you're going to be working with building up a material. Here's a nice example of a visual network. So our final surface is a blend, but into that blend we are mapping an environment sky, which is using a ground plane and a noise or a fractal to create basically the idea of a sky. So the picture of the ground is filling an attribute in the environment sky called the floor or the ground, and it creates this feeling of a floor. The fractal node is got its own attributes, which ends up looking like a sky with clouds, but this is being created with a procedure that's generating black and white values and some color, and then that's getting mapped into the environment sky attribute, and then that's going into the reflected color value of the blend. So the reflected color of this sphere is being basically faked. It's basically faking that it's in an environment, right? Instead of trying to reflect an object in an environment, it's very expensive sometimes to do that, and these are ways to create kind of create the feeling of something. That was why when we were back here and we were trying to render these out and we didn't have an environment, everything's black. That's because it's reflecting the dark black infinite void of space inside the computer, right? Or the computer screen. There's nothing to reflect. So in a perfect world, when we get to the point where we can build this idea of a world around this, that these things can reflect, can come through in the reflected color values, or truly actually be reflecting, then it can look and feel much more like it's in an environment, like a kitchen or outside or something like that. But right now, all we got is the darkness of space, and that's why everything looks black. Unless you can see this over here, where you can actually see things are reflecting in that scene, but there's not a lot else to reflect. Does that make sense? That's why things are so dark, and it's because we would have had to build an environment around it to actually reflect that, or fake it with an image map. But we haven't got into that yet. So we're getting into that now. So what you're going to be doing is you have some recipes for preparing some basic materials. This is just basically working on reflections. We'll get to that in a little bit. But what I want you to be doing is basically working on your material types. We've decided what kind of material it is. Is it shiny? Is it a metal? Is it a dull metal? Now we're going to be thinking about the textures. Or is it glass of some sort, where we can get into refraction. So really we have some recipes down here that I like using just as a means to giving us a starting point. So many of you have metal objects. Maybe they're painted metal. Maybe they're Some of you may have worn out metal if you don't want it to look perfect. But we have some basic starting points where we begin to get the attributes of, say, aluminum of some sort. If you want aluminum, you can see that we have the type is Fong. It has a blue-gray style color in both the specular color. So the specular highlight is going to have a slight blue-gray color to it. The color itself, the diffuse, the color that we'll see through the diffuse is going to be slightly gray. We're not worried about any of these values yet. We have a diffuse of 0.8, and that's probably the default value. And then a cosine power of 2 and a reflectivity of 0.2. And gives you that. You can see the reflection down here in this area and this area. So all metals are going to be a little bit different. If you want a polished metal, you're going to be bumping up the reflective value and using a different material. Here's a blend material. Same ideas for the color and the specular color. So the specular color is going to be this color here. The overall color of the object is going to be this color here. The diffuse value is set at the default. But then we start adjusting the eccentricity, the spread of the highlight over the surface, reducing it so you get a tighter spot or a tighter highlight here. And then the specular roll-off is going to be pulled all the way out so it spreads out and you get this much more broad sense of a kind of reflection. Does that make sense? So these are just recipes that you can go to, and I'm expecting you to go to, and set these values for your own projects as a starting point. Now this is where things get a little bit more complex when we use brushed metals, because brushed metals is where we're going to have to change things a little bit more. So this is where things are going to get a little more complex. We're not just adjusting values, we're actually going to start mapping or connecting files to our attributes. Notice that this has a fractal added to a bump map, and these little checkerboards are called mapping. These are your mapping buttons, and when they're mapped to something, it gives you that this has an input to it. See this little square with this triangle pointing into the left side? This is an input into the blend. So there's an input coming into it, not an output. So something, this fractal is coming into this material, and it is acting as a bump. And if you look down here, you can see that this object here isn't smooth like this one. You notice that this one doesn't have anything mapped to it. These are all just empty. But this one has a map coming into it, and I can see that here, and I can see it displayed here. And then we're using these different values. So today we're going to be looking at how we start to set up these mapping attributes, how we map something into another, into a material of some sort, so into one of these channels. Fine brushed metals is going to be the same type of thing, only in specular color there's going to be something mapped into it. So it's going to have something that controls the specular. So when the specular element is lit up, you can see that this has little spots, little specks in the specular. So it's using a black and white map to say, have specular on this white spot and don't have specular on this black spot. So it's turning it on and off, and it's creating a more speckled type of element within the specularity. It's not a texture, but it's controlling the specularity through black and white values. And you can see the results, how it gets this spotty kind of look, like just like if you have a dishwasher and you got water spots, you can see it's not so shiny in certain spots, it's dull in others. Does that make sense? Just like water spots on your car or anything that might be on a surface that's dirty, you can control what's shiny and what isn't. Fingerprints, another example. You could have fingerprints, you could have dirt, you could have any kind of element on your surface that would make it not look like it's brand new and perfect. Chrome and silver finishes have high reflectivity values and low eccentricity and high specular values. So it really starts to reflect. Notice it's black on top because the world, there's nothing to see. It's just the infinite, black void. But this ground plane is reflecting, having a high reflectivity on that object. And silver as well. And it's just a matter of changing some of these values and boosting some of these elements too, the eccentricity, the specular roll loss, and the reflectivity. So this is what we're going to be working on today. We're going to be looking at these different materials and applying them to simple geometry to kind of see what we get, and then look at how we can build up more complex types of materials for our purposes. Does that make sense to everybody? So let's bring up Maya and bring up a nice, just an empty scene here. Go ahead and create just a simple ground plane and label it. We'll label that ground plane. And I'm going to turn off my grid in my viewport. Actually, I'm going to turn off my grid in all my viewports by just going up to display and unchecking grid. So display, check on, turn it off, grid. So I have a ground plane. I'm going to name it ground plane, or just ground. All right. So let's begin with just this basic setup. So in our make sure I'm going to pull up my settings here. I'm going to go to my open render view, which is the clapperboard with the little eye on it. I'm going to go to my settings panel. I'm going to make sure I'm using Maya software for this. And I'm going to make, you can go ahead and use your 1024 setting, but I'm going to make mine bigger so that you can see it a little easier. So I'm going to make mine a little larger. I'm going to use the 2K, but it takes a little bit longer to render, but I just want you to be able to see it from where you're sitting. So under Commons, under our image size, I'm choosing 2K, but you use full 1024.
Do you want it to be a JPEG or?
That's fine, yeah. Good question. I'm going into my Maya settings, and I'm adjusting for intermediate quality for now, so I'll get a little less. And I'm going to turn on ray tracing because we will want that in a little bit. All right. So again, I'm in my Maya software. Make sure you're not rendering with Arnold. Maya software. In my Commons tab, you're going to choose 1024. You can choose a bigger size if you want to, but it will render slower. And I'm going to go into my software and choose intermediate quality and ray tracing for now. Onto this surface, I'm going to open up my attribute editor. So, I'm sorry, I'm going to select my surface, go to my attribute editor, and I can see I have all my inputs here. Here's my transform node, my material nodes, my render nodes, my shading networks, and then my final material here. I'm going to, I just want you to open this up, so it should say Lambert 1. We're going to change that. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to right-click, hold, go down to Assign New Material, and you'll notice that you get this Create tab. We've been looking at this as a kind of a single tab. Well, this is a part of the Hypershade. And I'm going to go up to Maya, and I'm going to simply choose a blend here. And when I do that, I'm going to get these blend nodes, and I'm going to name blend 1 ground. I'm just going to say GRND BLINN. And that way I know that that material is ground blend. All right, any questions with that so far? Everybody able to do that? All right, so we're just going to look at this ground plane for a little bit. And And what I want to do is introduce you to the hyper the Hypershade window so that you can kind of see it. So if I go up to my render area up here, and I have this little window, this little icon that looks like a sphere with a little highlight in it, I'm going to click that, and it's going to open up my Hypershade. Okay? Everybody able to find that and open that? So what we just saw was this Create panel that just popped out a minute ago. When I right-clicked, I just got this little Create panel, and we said Maya blend, and it created a blend for us. And here it is, ground blend, right? There it is in my materials tabs. I don't have anything else. What I want to do is I'm going to middle mouse on that, drag and hold and drag it down here. So middle mouse on this, drag down here. Okay, so here it is. Everybody see that? Everybody was able to do that? Very good. I'm going to delete that for a second. Oops, actually, I don't want to delete it. Control Z. What I want to do is look at the attributes here real quick. If I click on this, I still have over here common properties. So this is very similar to, if you see over here, my attributes here in my attribute editor. Here are the same attributes here being pulled up for me in this spot. So I could close that if I wanted, and I can see the attributes for this object. I can also, if I want to, I can select my object, and I can go into and click on this icon here, which is going to show me the graph materials on selected object, which is going to show me all of the nodes that are connected to this material. So this is my object, and it's flowing into my final shader network here, which here is that tab. If I click on this tab, I get my attributes. All right. Now we can move this around by clicking and dragging them, and if you notice there's this little wire, and this is the wire that connects one thing to another. Here, let me make it.
I'm sorry, how did you get the second box? Yeah.
This one?
Yeah, that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
So I selected it, and I clicked on this little map. I graph materials on selected objects. So I click on that when it's selected.
Okay. And then, it didn't come up.
So select your object here in your scene. So that's my ground plane, and now click that button. Did that come up?
I don't have it selected, that's why.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Does that work?
Well, sort of. I got too many windows there. I lost mine.
If I were to minimize this window, sometimes it goes down here outside of my, I don't know if you can see that, but down here it minimizes out of the view. So sometimes if you don't have your Maya scene at full window res, that can get lost kind of. You can have a bunch of little minimized areas down there that you might not know about. All right, so I've got this, and what we want to do is I want to map something into these channels. So you'll notice that here we have color, and over here we have this little black and white square map. And over here, excuse me, we have 2D textures and we have 3D textures, which we're going to be working with. We're going to be working with just basic 2D textures at the moment. And there's a list of them. Can you see those from where you're at? Bulge, checker, cloth. There's a file, and that's for images. Fluid, fractal, grid. Can you guys see all those? Let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is one of the easiest ways to connect something. Oh, what I was saying is this is a wire, and this is connecting a value. The output, the out color of this blend, so all of this stuff combined, and the out color value is going into the surface shader. So that wire is saying that these two things are connected. Can you see that wire? And if you hover over it, it'll say that the output, it's the blend out color is going into the Blend 1 SG surface shader of the, but we don't have to worry about that too much, but we are going to start building our own networks where we will, and I'm using the same camera controls to move around. So I'm holding down my middle mouse here, and I can move back and forth. If I middle mouse roll back, I can move, and you can't tumble, so I can just basically drag back and forth and move. So as I hold down my camera controls, I can move around in the scene. What I want to do is I want to connect something to the color channel just so that you can see it. I'm going to move this over a little bit, move this over a little bit. I'm going to back it off so you can kind of see. Right now, if I were to change the color of this, you can see that the color on my plane is changing. If I click on this, I can actually choose a color. So you could make this any solid color that you want by choosing your color picker. This is called the hue. This is the hue around the outside. So if we wanted an orange color or green or blue or whatever. And then here's where we can add a shade by adding black to it, or add white to it by dragging this way, or any shade, any tone of gray in the middle. So we choose our hue on the outside, and then we customize that color by moving around this little selector inside of this cube here. And then you can see all these values kind of going crazy as we start to add gray, or if we shade it or change the value, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to make a simple little color here. And I'm going to click off once I click off. So I've got this brown color. So if I wanted a solid, I could do that. But let's say I don't want a solid. I want to put a checkerboard on there. So this is going to be the first kind of classic example of mapping something. Into my color value, I'm not going to click into the color here. I'm going to go to the mapping icon. And it's going to, when I click on that, it's going to give me my Create Node window is going to pop up. And I'm going to choose of my 2D textures here, I'm going to choose checker. And when I do that, and I hit the 6 on my keyboard, I will be able to see that texture show up on my surface in my scene. If I press 5 on my keyboard, I only see gray. If I press 6 in my keyboard, I will see that. So look in your actual scene. Yeah, so I'm kind of keeping these things so you can see that.
Well, I'm behind again.
Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to do. That you're doing, some of you are doing what I want you to be doing, and that is looking at these attributes for the input. So here we are. We can look at our ground blend into the color channel. It has something being mapped into it. It is the checker icon. So if we click on the node for checker, and I'm going to move these together closer so you can see that. Try to move some of this stuff so you can see it. Notice that this is sending out its output color of the checker into the color of the blend. And this has the attributes for it have our color 1 and our color 2. So if we click on a color, we can easily change the color of our color 1. We can easily change the color of our color 2. And we can adjust the contrast of that so that they're not so harsh. So those are attributes that we can work with. Now here's the tileable part. Now, so this icon is dealing with the details of the checker. The placement at node is dealing with the placement of that object. So if I click on the placement texture, notice that it has some attributes here. If we use the rotate frame attribute, look what happens. It spins that image or that texture around. See how it's spinning around by just sliding this back and forth? So it's controlling the placement of that material or that actual checker attribute. That's just rotating in the image. Are you all right, George, you got it?
No,
Where are you at to get to the?
how'd you get to that?
So I'm clicking on the place 2D node.
Yep, got it.
Place 2D. And, all right. Now if I rotate UVs, it's going to look similar, but it's not the same. You don't have to worry about that so much. That's just a different way. Now look at this. Repeat UV. This is a very important for the tiling properties. So if you have a material that is tiling, the repeat X, repeat Y values are very important. Look at how it is by default. If I repeat more times in X, say 10, it repeats in 10, it repeats in X, and if I wanted to make, and now it's repeating 10 times in basically U and V, X and Y. So we can change these values. Notice that we do that through the placement node. If I wanted a very, very small checker, I could put that in. If I wanted, whatever value I needed, if I wanted them to be asymmetric, I could say 10 for this one, and I could say 5 for this one, and I get different effects.
So can I ask a question?
Mhm.
So when you were in the images earlier with the breaks,
Yes.
is that how you would?
Yes,
Okay.
that's exactly how you would
Okay.
do it. So by default, I had 4. I don't care what your value is here. You can make once you have it here, you can do it. Now here's something really, really cool. So you can take something like this, and even though it's checkers, you don't have to leave it to be checkers because we can play with these attributes a little bit. So for example, the noise attribute will introduce noise into your model. Now it doesn't take much. So if I introduced 0.2 noise, look at what happens to the edges of my model. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not the edges of my model, the edges of my texture. Notice how it begins to spread and it produces noise. If I put in a huge number, I would probably crash it, but look how I can make splotchy types of material from a checker just by experimenting. So I don't have to always get what it says it is, right? So you can experiment with this stuff and create some really unique things. The more intense these values are, the more eye-burning they become. So it is up to you to experiment a little bit with that and see what you get. You might come up with something quite pleasing. All right? So that is the checker. Okay? I am going to disconnect this by selecting this wire here and hitting delete. Notice that this goes back to nothing, and checker is just simply floating out there.
Do you want us to do that, right?
Yeah, go ahead and disconnect checker. And to clear my scene, I'm going to select my object and just click on this to get that stuff out. Now notice that the checker still exists in my library, if you will. You see up here that checker attribute is still there. And the utilities for it, to place it someplace, is in my utility. So here's my 2D texture utility. So the checker is here. And I can double click on it and bring up its attributes if I want. And then the material for the ground is still here.
How'd you get rid of it in here? I did disconnect.
So what I did is I just selected my object and then I just clicked on this map the network again. So because they're not connected, it doesn't bring it back up. Let's go back to color and let's look at something else. All right, let's look at something else. Let's look at a basic noise. So I'm going to say color. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to say 2D grid. I'm going to say, color. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to choose ramp. My ramp attribute.
Sorry, how do you
Sorry.
stop checker one more time?
I'm going to select this wire, and I'm going to just hit delete and take it away. And then to clear it, I'm just going to select my node and just say map the connected. Well, I'm going to, sorry, not my node. Select my object, and then just say, so bring up everything that's feeding into it. So it's kind of a quick way to see what's feeding into your material, what's feeding into your surface or your geometry. Were you able to do that? Okay.
So what's the new?
So in the color attribute of my blend, I'm going to go in, choose my mapping button, and then I'm going to choose ramp. So here's a ramp. And what ramp does is it creates a gradient. And if you look at your materials, I'm going to look at my object over here. I'm going to move it so you can see it a little bit. You can see that if you select the node for it, the ramp node, which is what has come up, notice that it actually has the ramp node and the place 2D texture node here. If I were to mess with this, I could still do the same types of things here and here by rotating that node. But I want you to look at the ramp attributes. Everybody able to see that? So it is black and white. It's a black and white ramp. And you have the ability there to see the two colors. So here's the colors of the black that I can slide across here. Here's the white value that I can slide across here. I can actually move them across each other like this. Notice how they hop around and move around each other. If I click on the little white button up at the top, I can actually choose a color. I can actually change that color, which I'll use my, if I click on that and then click on the select color attribute, I get some of the colors I've used already coming up down here. So I have my purple and my green that I used and that brown that I used. And then if I click on this black button or this black spot, I can choose its color by doing the same thing here. So I have, are you able to do that?
I lost the
Working on
color
it.
again.
I lost it once too.
All right, let me show you.
That color,
Watch.
no, I don't.
If you click inside this box, you'll get a new attribute that you can replace one. Click it by replacing the one at the bottom by clicking on this box at the bottom. That'll get rid of it. Or if I click inside of here, I can get a new one, and then I can change its color to be whatever I want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
If I want more colors in here, let's say I want to add 4 or 5 different color values, you can add whatever, as many as you like for your scene. So now I've got 3 colors. That makes sense? There you go. There you go. Brett.
Is there a way to invert the gradient? Like, I'm gonna be, try using a circular ramp.
So up here, you can choose the different kinds that there are, right? And if you go down into your material node and invert it, you can invert you want to invert the values
No, well, not
technically, or
not
just
invert the,
switch them.
Yeah, not invert the values, yeah, just.
So you can have a V ramp or a U ramp. You can have a diagonal ramp or a radial ramp like this. But I like the circular ramp. That might be what you're talking about.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was a way to just invert the black and white value.
Just move it.
Yeah, just.
Yeah,
basically switch
yeah, just switch it. Or just change the color. Turn
Yeah.
one white to one black.
I was just wondering
That's
if
the
it was
easiest way.
hockey or something.
I've never used one. If there is one, the invert function that I see here, but that actually inverts the color.
Yeah.
Selected. You can add waves to this. So again, as we start to experiment with these colors, and you can add noise to it too. So we can begin with one thing and end up with something completely different. What's nice is all of these nodes have these different levels of attributes that can be quite interesting. So for instance, the ramp gives you a variety of types of ramp, box ramps, and four corners.
60s.
Yeah, you can do just the regular old U or V, which means it's going to go top to bottom, or horizontal. One way is horizontal, one way isn't. You have a radial. I guess I should turn off all this noise so you can actually see what it's doing. But you can experiment with these things, and you can kind of see what it's trying to do. So it's trying to create a ring of color instead of it being, so it's going from here and going around to the end. Let me help some folks if you need help.
I just noticed.
Thank you.
Oh, shoot.
So if you select this object and you go into your attribute editor here, you can see in the color value that it's got something mapped to it. And if I click on that, it will bring up what it is that's being mapped into that, which happens to be our ramp. So it's very similar to going this way. So here's my blend node. Something's mapped into it. Yes, it's these two things. It's my ramp. Something's mapped into the ramp, and that is my placement node. Inside my ramp attribute, which I can get to by simply just working out of my blend attributes, I have different calculations or different types of ramps. Here, I have the standard one is basically a ramp that is basically going to be from top or bottom or right or left. So V is going to be up and down. Think vertical ramp. Okay, so think of a vertical ramp. U is going to be a horizontal ramp. So think of it horizontally. Diagonal is going to be just that. It's going to be diagonal. Radial is going to try to create a point where it begins and ends in a kind of a radial. Now I like, and I use circular a lot. So here it is. Not only is it trying to create a ramp in a variety of ways, it also gives you the ability of how clean or how smooth do you want that transition to be. So none creates hard rings. So notice that if I turn that off, I get hard rings, which I could make dark. I could do something like this, and I could create graphic logos. If I use linear, it's going to smooth all those things out. The closer these are together, the harder that ring is going to be. If I want an exponential, it'll just, you can go through there and kind of see what they do. And this is something for you to just experiment around with and just kind of see how it looks. All right? So here's a kind of a neat thing you can do. If I said none, and I made a simple little pattern like this, right? Well, it's not simple necessarily. And if I went back to my my placement node, which is just this tab right here that controls its placement, and if I began to repeat that, I can make a cool little pattern just out of that by repeating it. So if you needed spots or something quickly in your scene, maybe there are holes in a grid or something like that, maybe you needed to define holes or something, you could quickly make something like that. Now these could just be white on black or something like that.
That's different.
Mm-hmm. All right.
It's ugly, but it's different.
All right. All right, so that is a ramp. That way you can make a nice transition of a material to your object. Let's do one more, and then this is going to set up our ground plane for our object. So if we don't want this, and we don't want to work in the hypershade, if I want to disconnect this, watch this because you're going to want to do this probably more than anything else. Over here on color channel, if I right click and say break connection, it breaks the connection. There's no more connection. So that's a simple way to delete that wire, that connection that we saw in our hypergraph. See, it's gone.
How did you do
That
that?
connection is gone.
So you just
One more
went to,
time.
So over here, over color, or anything that's been mapped, I'm just gonna go over the word color,
Oh, to the word. color.
right
Okay.
click, and say break connection.
Got it.
And there we go. It's broken. Okay?
pink, back to ugly gray.
Yep.
Hmm.
Did you get it to work?
With the little word.
No.
In here?
Then the word color. Right click
Oh.
over it.
Break connection.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go back to my plane over here, select it, clear my attributes here. Currently, I don't have anything in my scene. I'm not worried about this one, so I'm just gonna move it off to the side. I don't need that. So let's go back to our colored mapping attribute. And what I'm gonna do it a different way. So I'm gonna go to 2D over here. And I'm going to use the grid. So here's 2D grid, and I'm going to choose 2D grid, and it drops that into my scene. So now I have it into my scene here. Try to give myself a little bit of space. So I use the 2D grid, and I dropped it in. Now it's not connected yet to anything. I always like to move these things kind of close to their connections. So notice that this has a color channel here. This is my blend material. And this is my grid. It has attributes just like everything else. It's just got black and white lines that create a grid. But they're not connected yet. What I want to do is connect them. So if I go into my color attribute, my color out, and if I grab this little dot and if I drag it over to here, I can drag and plug it in to color, just like I just did right there. And that connected it. Here, I'll show you again. See how these are connect, this alpha, this out color to color. And I've connected the out color to color. So that's another way you can connect. Is everybody able to do that by just plugging it in? I'm going to disconnect that. Another way you can do it is to take your mouse over the grid, middle mouse hold, drag it over the attribute that you want, and release. Now it's connected that way. So that's another cool way to do it. It's kind of interactive. So far we've got 3 ways. Color, mapping button, choose the whatever we want, and it's connected. Create a material or create a texture and then map it by connecting the color channel to it. Or middle mouse over the texture and dragging it over to the thing that you want. So we'll say color. Does that make sense? So now we have, let's go ahead and I'm just going to hide that hyper shade. I'm going to frame in my material. And I'm just going to work with the properties through the properties attribute panel by going into the color inputs and looking at them here. This is a lot less cumbersome. Same thing, we have black and white lines, and we can choose the colors for that by just choosing colors that we like. If I click on this, I can choose the colors that I like. One is going to be the filler color, so that's going to be the color that is going to be not lines, and then you have your line color. So here's my line color, which I can control. Okay? If you wanted to have a specific color from, say, a specific picture that you have, let's say you have an animal that you want specific colors from. If you double click on the color box here, you can actually load a picture into this color area where it says image, and in your source images folder, if you had something in your source images folder, you could actually choose a picture. So for instance, I don't have this set up as a project, but in my project source images folder, I think I have a fish. So here in my fish, if I wanted this orange color, I could then click on one of these colors and it will add it into my, I can use that as a custom color from an image. So there I have that color right there. So that's another thing that you could do when you are working on something. Say you need the exact color of an object, you can simply go and choose it off of something. Okay? I'm going to say done. The width of the lines are controlled by the width slider in U. So think of things being U being horizontal, V being vertical. So V and U. And then we have our 2D placement nodes, which allow us to duplicate this however many times that we need to create a grid. Oops, I screwed that one up. I'm going to go back into my inputs, and that should have been 10. And then you can see now I have a grid object, or a grid. All right, is everybody able to do that?
No.
Just the last part.
So in the inputs, and if I look at the values for repeat, so I'm in my 2D placement node. If I change these values, then I can alter. So if I just put 1 and 1, I get this nice little whatever that is. I have the thickness of the lines that I can adjust. Yeah, so I can do thickness of the lines. I can control the contrast, so if I want to mute those down. And then with our same things that we've had before, if we add some noise to it, we can swirl up the edges, and it's just possible to get all kinds of cool little things here as we go.
There you go.
I've never done that before. That's cool. It's like a little drippy paint. All right? So lots of things that you can do and experiment with here. So what we want to do is we want to make a grid floor. Everybody okay?
Oh, no, yeah.
Okay.
I got such bright colors now.
Oh, I know. Don't trip out too much on that. You don't have to do bright colors.
Another blended in over here.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, be kind to your classmates. Don't blind us. So I'm going to go back and just create a boring brown and a very basic ground plane. So we'll just choose some colors because we just want to basically have some grid lines, and I'm going to get rid of all my noise, and we'll just make a little grid just like we would if it was, if we were looking out on a football field or something. So I'm just going to use,
Okay. And, catch up sooner.
all right, so just a very simple, I'm going to mute that down by just bringing down some of the contrast a little bit so it's not too much in my eyeballs, burn my eyes. All right. So there is, those are 2D textures. There's a bunch of them. Can't go through all of them. I want to show you now. Are you guys okay? You want to take a break or do you want to keep going? So I just have a sphere here that is just nothing special. On it, I put a blend material. I called that sphere blend, and I did that so that I could see it more easily when I look at these nodes, and I can see what it says. Because a lot of times, if they all say blend, blend, blend 1, blend 2, blend 3, then it's very difficult. Like these all say place texture 1, place texture 2, place texture. That doesn't tell me what they're actually connected to. So typically, I want to be able to know what this is on. So I'll name it. So we have a ground plane and we have a sphere. And to that sphere, we're going to add, and I'm just going to work here in my attribute editor for a minute. So in my color channel, what I want to do is I want to create a 3D texture now. So I'm going to go up. We've looked at a few 2D textures. So we've looked at checker and we've looked at grid and fractal or noise. We're going to go to the 3Ds, And we're going to look at, for now, let's just start at the top and say Brownian. And I want you to notice one thing that's very important. A, you should be able to see it, so make sure you have the 6 key selected. So you should see this black and white kind of cloudy looking material on it. But you also have this little excuse me, this cage that is actually a 3D placement node. In our other objects, we had 2D placement nodes. So let me show you that. We have these 2D placement nodes. Now we have a 3D placement node. The 2D placement node is a little bit different. This has the, repeat and up and the offset and the rotate. But a 3D texture node is using transform attributes. It's a little bit different than anything that we've done so far. Are you guys able to see that? So you should be able to see that.
It's all right, got lost.
Oh, that's interesting. Catch up and you'll be okay.
Everybody able to follow that?
I am now.
All right, let's do it one more time. So I have my blend object here in my scene. And what I want to do is I want to connect it with a 3D material. So the 3D materials look like these over here on the side. We've got Crater and Brownian. And we're just going to work with the Brownian for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to just click on that and bring that into my scene. So I have these 2 new nodes brought into my scene. I have a 3D placement node, which is this icon that's in my actual scene here. It's not connected to my sphere yet, so you can't see anything. So here's my out color of my Brownian, my out color here, not the alpha, but the color. And I'm going to connect that to my color here. Once I do that, I can see the actual output of that material. It looks like a cloud of some sort. And what I have then is I actually have a node or an interactive control that I can see. Can you see that? And as I move this control, it scales the actual texture. Notice that the details of the texture are starting to get more and more spread out and softer. And as I scale it in, the details of that object get tighter and tighter and tighter and smaller and smaller and smaller. I think the Brownian is kind of like the surface of an avocado, kind of a rough fruit. And when we look at this, it kind of provides that sort of material. Notice that if I translate this object, the 3D texture node, if I translate this, it is moving the fluid, or what looks like a fluid, texture, over the surface. What's cool is, because I can move this, I can rotate it in different ways, and I can compress it in different ways. So if I compress this down, it can kind of make stripes on my object. If I rotated it around, I can change the angle of those stripes. So I have a little bit more control over that material than I had on some of the others. If I were to render that out a little bit, notice how I have a kind of a granite type of surface. If I scale that down and render that out, you can see how it provides kind of these striped bands with a lot of detail kind of in that surface. Everybody able to do that?
The little box.
When something is missing in your scene, one of the first things I do is go into wireframe and look in my world so that you can see things that are under things. Go into your attribute, go into your outliner and see if the node is actually in your scene, and then hit the F key to frame it in to go straight to it. Figure out where it is. Everybody able to do that? So let's look at some of the nodes of the attribute for Brownian. if I select my object and I go into my blend 3, if I go into my inputs, then I just have a few. There's not a ton here. I have lacunarity. Everybody knows what that means. As I start to work with this, I can see that it starts to kind of build those swirls and they get stronger. It's almost like looking at an atmospheric cloud map or something. And then the increments of that kind of start to soften them. And then the octaves, the octaves kind of start to soften it as well. And then the weight, this gives me the ability to kind of increase some of the activity, not too much. And you can kind of see as I add some values here, it does change the overall amount of the swirl and the details on it. So the idea with this is that you can, it's again, there's a lot of experimentation with this as I kind of make some changes and then render it out to kind of see hopefully what I can see in my actual object. My scene's a little bit big. So I can see the reflection of my object, but you can see this looks kind of like a cloudy material. You can work with this icon, move it around, and kind of get a different kind of texture. Let's look at something different. So I'm going to break that material. I'm going to select my sphere, break connection here, and then try something different. So I'm going to go back to my color mapping. And what were you working with, Brett? You said you work with marble?
Yeah.
So there's lots of different ones. Marble has some pretty cool attributes to it. And again, it has an icon that if you move it or scale it down or move it around, you can see that surface swirling. If I scale it up, sometimes the material might not look the way you want it to look because your object is either really big or the material isn't quite right. So you might get something that looks like this, you know, when you go in your scene. And you want to remember with a 3D material, you can scale that up and you can work with it. So it may not look the way you expect, but because you can interact with it, you can end up with something that you didn't expect. So this is going to feed into. So notice this is an input. This is an output. If I click on this output, it'll go into my marble settings because it's feeding into my marble. So I was in this icon, I was in my 3D, then it feeds into the marble, and then that feeds into the color channel of my object here. So my 3D placement, my marble attributes, and then that feeds into the color channel of my object, or of my material. So the marble attributes have some basic things. We have a filler color, which is the base color of the object. Okay, filler color. And then we have vein color, so we can adjust the vein color here. So you can choose the different colors that you want. You can make a planet. If I adjust the vein width, that's going to open up the vein. So this is kind of like tightening up the veins of the object. I can soften the edges with the diffusion. So this makes it harder. This makes it softer overall. So it starts to blend those colors. Vein width, bring that width down. Sometimes we can mess with these too much and it loses the look that we want. It gets a little hard. Then overall, you can adjust the contrast of those as well. There is noise attributes that you can work with that will take away some of the noise on the edges. So if you want more noise, there's ratio values. So you can increase and decrease this. So there's lots and lots and lots of things to experiment with. And you can increase the ripples in X, Y, and Z. If I increase the ripples in X, you can see how it starts to stretch. So I'm looking in the X attribute. If I said 1, if I said 20, it starts to swirl that. Okay. If I adjust the ratio value, it can kind of pull that, back that off. And the amplitude can bring it back in. And this is going to be interesting to just kind of experiment with. Again, and then if you take that node, and if I scale it down, I get something different. If I scale it up, I get something a little different. If I rotate it, I'll get something a little different. Everybody able to do that? So this kind of looks like a planet atmosphere. So we'll look at one more here. All of these are things to experiment with, and that's what this assignment is about. The texture. If you look at the treatment study, you're just going to be playing and exploring these to create a bunch of variety of objects. A variety with these little bumps, these different types of 3D and 2D textures, and colors. So now we've introduced colors, so you've got to use your color theory. So these are kind of warm and cool colors and a few neutral colors thrown in. So just the idea of choosing a color palette, working with analogous or complementary, or just more natural, or what I like is what I was saying before is choose like an animal or a plant that has colors and use those colors in your scene. So I had that fish example in my material type, and you can choose and take samples off of an object like that. And so those are the types of things to experiment with for this little study. This is a bunch of spheres with different materials on them. And so far we've just looked at basically the color attribute. And if I break connection on that, and if we looked at one more in the 3D texture element, stucco is kind of similar, or crater. Here's crater. Crater is kind of similar, but it gives you 3 channel options, and it gives you some additional elements here. So you have the ability to kind of blend and smooth the way these colors blend with one another. So this is called the crater. And then you have these colors. We have a red channel, a green channel, or just channel 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't have to have specifics. And then the ability to kind of melt these together. And balance them out, kind of smooth them out a little bit, and then increase or decrease the frequency on that. Again, with the texture node here, or the 3D node, I've got a bunch of them in my scene, but you can see this one here as I scale it, or as I rotate it, or if I scale it up, or scale it down, or if I disproportionately scale it, I get just other types of effects as well, which may be interesting as we kind of experiment with things. So I can get kind of a striated type of effect. Does that make sense? So experimenting with some of these. Another popular one is leather. If you go in, break the connection. Leather is here. It's the same, has these cells that, I'll render it out so you can actually see it. So it has these cells that you can see that make up the pattern, the fill, and then the cell lines. And so you can see the crease sizes, or the crease colors. The cell size can be increased or decreased. The density can be reduced, so there's not that many. The spottiness, randomness, can actually make it less random. Can decrease the. You can actually make this look a little less random and more procedural. A kind of taking away some of the randomness and of the edges. All right. So some of these, a lot of these objects just take some time to explore and learn about. And that's what this texture study is about, this treatment study. But what I want to show you is some other things that can be done with this. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is adding it as for bumps. When you can actually use a black and white value for a bump. So I'm going to start with a fresh material, and I'm going to get rid of these things here. Get rid of all this stuff in my scene. So here I have my plane sphere, and what I want to do is I want to give it in color. Let's just give it a ramp, just a simple ramp, so it's just a little gradient here. Well, actually, before we do that, let's go ahead. If you've added it, just say break that. When you work with bumps, it's probably best to see the bump itself visually instead of trying to figure out what it's going to look like. So let's just do this simply. Let's, to the color channel, let's map a 3D texture. So let's map something new, something we haven't already manipulated. And let's just do a simple Brownian. Okay? And so I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to leave it just like that. And I'm going to change my image size so it's not so big. And if I was to render this out as it is, it looks just like this. Just as gray spots on it, right? Okay, so that's a color. Now what I want to do is I want to take that same material and I want to say, you know what? I want these white areas to be elevated and I want these dark areas to be pushed in. Okay, so if you can imagine what that would look like on a surface. It's not going to technically change the surface, it's just going to make it look like it's a little bumpier than it is, right? So I'm going to use my Hypershade window so you can kind of see this, and I'm going to move this over a little bit. So I'm going to select my object and clear out my scene so that it's clean with just the things that I'm using. We can use the same nodes to do more than one thing. So this same node can be used for color, and it can be used for reflection, it can be used for lots of things. What I want to do with it is use it as a bump. Okay? So here in my attributes, sometimes it's hard to see, but if you look over here in my attribute editor for this blend, the blend has a bump mapping area here. Okay? What I want to do is I want to drag my Brownian from here by middle mouse and holding and drag it over the bump map and connect it to a bump. And I'm going to do that. Okay, so I wanted you to be able to see it as I do this, so I'm going to Alright, so here's my object. Make sure I have it here. And here's my bump. I'll get close so you can see it. And I'm going to middle mouse hold, and then find my bump mapping and then drop it on there. And you'll see it instantly starts to look like my object has bumps on it. Everybody able to do that before I go anywhere else? Huh?
What you did.
One more if you would.
So what I have is I have a Brownian node, and I want to connect it to not only my color channel, so here's my color channel, I want to connect it to the bump normal mapping channel here. And the way I'm going to do that is to middle mouse hold and drag from here to here. And when I make that connection, I get a new node. Notice that I have this purple node here. That is what's called a bump, 3D bump. And it has a value, so if I click on that, I actually have a depth value here. That if, as I increase or decrease that, it increases the value or the intensity of that, both positive and negative. So as I go negative, it'll just invert the values, and if I go positive, okay? Now remember that it's connected to it's the same thing I'm using for my color channel. So I can go in and I can kind of see what's happening as that value changes. If I were to render that, it will make my object look a little lumpy. Very lumpy, actually. So this is kind of like a hedge apple. It doesn't technically change the geometry, but it adds a whole lot of information over the surface. Makes it a lot more interesting. Everybody able to do that? One of the things I like to do when I'm rendering out different variations is to take a sample of it like this, and then as I change a value, I might re-sample that to see what just changed. So as I change the value in my alacrinarity and I update, I can see what I had and what has changed and how it's adding to it, or what it's adding or what it isn't. So if I decrease or increase certain things, you can kind of see what I'm going to get. Anybody able to do that? Successful? This is where it gets real interesting. So now if I have my object, if I broke the color value, it's still going to render kind of the same, right? It doesn't look that much different. But then I could put in other textures in here. So if I added a ramp of some sort, just like we were doing before, adding in different color values. I can start to add to my object, and now I'm getting a little bit more of an interesting, style of object. It's it's starting to build. So as I start to build my object, oops, I don't want that one. I might control where these spots are a little bit. Since this is a map, a color map, I might just move my object around. So now I have color, something defining the color, and something defining the surface quality of my object. Now that's pretty intense surface quality. And so I might want to back that off either by controlling, doing something to reduce the amount of detail this is going to amp up the little details. So again, I'll sample an area and I will look and see what those changes are. So the octaves are really adding in those fine details. And as I back that off, you can start to see that it becomes more of a gradual type of shift in the surface.
So we're having two textures here, right?
This has a color. This has a map to the color, which is just a ramp. And this has a Brownian defining the bump. So I have a bump map connected to the Brownian. And I used the Brownian at the beginning as a color so I could see what it looked like. And then I disconnected it. Because you can't see the bump. Well, you can see it. You can see it as a bump, but not as a color. Does that make sense? So as I start to modify the values of this and change things, I can start to craft a little bit the type of object that I've got. Now this is a 3D bump, right? So this actually could get messy if I start to modify, oops, I changed my render. If I start to modify it by either scaling it up, so if I scaled it up, it changes things. If I scale it down, let's see what it does. It gets smaller. If I squish it in Y, I get striations across there. If I keep it squished in Y and then squish it up, so this leads to a lot of experimentation in some cases, where I can get some pretty cool looking surfaces by just a few things. Now this isn't actually changing the surface of the model. It's just making it look like it's got bumps. It's still perfectly smooth, or it's generally smooth. Does that make sense? Everybody okay? You're quiet.
One more question. About the question I just asked. So basically, you broke the connection between Brownian, the color,
Yes.
and then added a new color to connect to the.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gotcha.
That is correct. Everybody okay? You weren't able to get it?
Well, I have the color, but it's not showing up.
Let's see. The homework is you're going to be creating spheres. Notice that these have a variety of things. So let me show you. I got 2 minutes. Let me show you one quick thing. What you can do, and let me if you add a material to an object and that material has channels, so if I assign a new material here and then into the color channel, let's say I have, let's do, Crater has 3 channels into it. So let's just say, I'll just do 2. So I'm looking for the marble. Where's it at? Marble. So into this, you could map something else. So in the filler color, I could map something like leather. So then in the crease, so now I have a material that has a different material mapped into the fill color, and then in vein I could map something else. So into that I could map in another value, so of crater value. So you can think of those options, or these objects that we're working with, these materials, as placeholders of space. So that marble material becomes a window to open and reveal something else. So I have another material inside of it. So imagine it being like a picture behind something that I can control and increase and decrease the value of it. So I have a leather in one space and a crater in another space, and I can control the blending of those two by experimenting with this sort of thing. So I can reveal that crater. You can see the crater in those spaces. Does that make sense? So it can be a really cool, this is why I say there's a lot of experimentation in this. So that's how you make some of these really cool things. So inside a cell space might have other textures. And then I might, on top of all of that, put something completely different for the bump, right? So the bump itself could be a completely different type of material or object that creates a strange and unusual type of bump. And so it can get really interesting when you start to combine these things. So I have texture with leather in one space, I have crater in another, and then I have a different object creating the bump that is a Mandelbrot or whatever. So this does take a lot of exploration. It does take a lot of creativity. And you don't want to just, when you combine that with colors and not just leaving thing in there, as default, you can create some very nice, very, very nice things. All right, that's a lot of stuff for today. I will see you all.